Peas on Moss is brought to you by Kimberly Schaub, a culinary scientist turned business developer. Over the past 4 years, the audience has downloaded episodes over 40,000 times, and we have 1,500 impressions across the website and a host of social media platforms. Will you consider contributing to the show to help keep it on air? Donations through Patreon help to offset the costs of web hosting, editing, and producing the various Peas on Moss offerings, from podcast episodes to videos, and every little bit helps, from corporate advertisement to sponsored content and private contributions. Reach out to me on peasonmoss.com for details. Hi, Peas on Moss listeners. I'm bringing you a special episode mashup with my new friend Richard Rycraw for this month's podcast. Richard Rycraw is a young food scientist working for Isinglass Estate Winery in Kansas. Richie started the Get Rich podcast during the early parts of the pandemic as a way to see what job opportunities in the food industry there were. The idea quickly expanded to interviewing people of every background and walk of life in every field to share insights on what it takes to work in each field. The Get Rich podcast is not only a play on his name, but also coincides with the motto of the podcast: to get rich, not strictly in money, but also in the satisfaction from finding the career that perfectly suits one's talents and passions. Rich is a member of the Research Chefs Association Hustlers Under 40, and he's a member of the IFT. In our discussion, we talk about our respective work and career paths, and he shares with me the untold story of wine in the United States. It was important to use February's episodes as one that features an up-and-coming African-American food professional. Historical achievements and contributions by African Americans are undeniable, as we have learned about the development of the cuisine of the American South, cultivation of rice and other staples, and re-examination of agriculture in the U.S. As we've all been journeying through the pandemic, we're also taking time to find history and stories that have been ignored, suppressed, or even changed to skew our understandings. Stories of Black and Indigenous peoples' lived experiences, interwoven with pioneering adventures of the Western expansion, are finally being shared, and this enriches our understanding of our legacies and gives us context for how we can move forward together. Enjoy this episode featurette, originally posted on the Get Rich podcast. Thanks, and talk to you next month.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Get Rich podcast, where we get rich not strictly in money, but also in the satisfaction from finding the career that perfectly suits our talents and passions. I am your host, Richard Rycraw, and today we have another very special guest and a very special episode. Today's episode will be the last episode of the 2021 year. So stay tuned for next year with new guests and new jobs to learn about. But for today, this episode is very special because it's my first ever joint episode. So it's a joint podcast between the Get Rich podcast and my guest, Miss Kimberly Schaub, who is a research chef, and she hosts her own podcast called Peas on Moss. Her podcast, like I said, it's called Peas on Moss, which is a wordplay on mise en place. And the goal of her podcast is to highlight the varied pathways and successes in the food manufacturing industry. So if you're curious about, learning more about different career opportunities, and, just different paths within the food industry, go check out her podcast. It's everywhere. Listen to episodes of those. And if you want to learn more about Kimberly herself, definitely go check that out. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. And so for today's episode, I talked to Kimberly. I interview her about her job as a research chef. And, we talk about how she got interested in it, how she learned about it, her, long and winding path to getting to where she is now. And a little bit on how she started her podcast. And then she, flips the tables on me a little bit and asked me about, my job and, a little bit about the history of winemaking and viticulture here in the Midwest. So I share a little bit about that. And, we talk a little bit about that, future plans, how I started my podcast, all that stuff. And it's a great, great conversation. And like I said, go check out her podcast, Peas on Moss. Can't recommend it enough. And without further ado, let's jump right into the interview. All right. So, Ms. Kimberly Schaub, thank you for agreeing to be on the Get Rich podcast with me.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for inviting me. This is so exciting.
Yeah, no, same. And so, we have you on here today to talk about, being a research chef. So is being a research chef, is that something that you had always wanted to do, or you kind of stumble upon that, later on?
Such a great question. It's definitely a stumble upon sort of situation. In high school, I definitely had no idea what food product development was, what food science was. That didn't even occur to me. So going back to high school, I always preferred science over some of the other courses. So I had in my head that I was going to be a biology pre-med major, go to med school, do amazing things, save lives, that kind of thing, right? I think that's half the people who go into science.
Yeah.
And I got to college and, all of the biology majors that I met wanted to be doctors and do that whole thing that we just talked about. And so I found out very quickly that in college, I definitely fell into the middle of the pack as opposed to the ones at top who are going to get into grad school first or med school. And I just also lacked the passion for biology. So I was looking through, actually, I was sitting next to the TA in my biology class, and I was just I don't know what I'm doing. And they were like, well, why don't you look through the catalog and see what other courses are out there? And so I went and talked to the professor, and he was like, well, the professor right next door is a nutrition science professor. You have a passion for food. Why don't you go explore nutrition science? And I was like, is that like home ec? And it's definitely not like home ec. Nutrition science actually turned out to be really similar to biochemistry. And so I can tell you a lot about what happens to food in our bodies after you swallow it. And that's what my undergrad is in. And I was in Washington State volunteering at a soup kitchen. And the chef I was working for at the time was like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I'm here in Washington trying to get my registered dietitian training and do an internship and all of that and get a master's of public health. But what I had actually said was I want to be an RD chef, so registered dietitian chef. So I was also going to go to culinary school and go in that direction. He completely misheard me because chefs are notorious for hearing what they want to hear. And he heard R&D chef or research chef. And he spent the entire shift talking to me about how cool it was to be a research chef. And I was like, hold up, what? What is this thing? And so I went to culinary school and I was like, yeah, I want to be a research chef. And all the chef instructors we were expecting to hear, oh, you want to open your own restaurant and stuff. They're like, you want to do a what? So I literally just kind of was like, I think it's a job and I want to try it. And so they started connecting me with chefs in the industry who were doing unusual activities. I mean, it was chefs like Kathy Casey, who is a mixology chef. She's well known in the Seattle area from the 80s and 90s as a chef, and then moved into mixology and beverage and is really cutting edge with a lot of that. So I interned for her, and I had an internship in modernist cuisine and got to try all of these kind of unusual non-restaurant-y roles until I eventually found a company that actually had a product development role and kind of pushed my way in that way, keeping that culinary identity and then going into product development that way. So, nope, definitely did not know what a research chef was, but kind of stumbled / made my way into it.
No, I like that. And I feel like that's kind of the story for a lot of people. For me, when I was in high school, I didn't even know what food science was. I didn't know it was a thing until I started, looking for colleges and, it was like, I really like science and I like food, and then type in majors with food and science. And you're just like, whoa, yeah, that's actually a thing. That's crazy. Yeah. So that's really interesting.
Smart to have Googled that and then seen what comes up. I should have done that, food and science, and see what lands.
Yeah. Yeah. It was that was the first thing that popped up. And I'm like, oh, interesting. Okay. But yeah, that's really cool. That's awesome that, having all those different opportunities, and kind of similar related fields, but still kind of different, to where you could pull the experiences together into being, a research chef. That's pretty awesome. And so I guess for those who don't know or don't really have experience with research chefs, would you be able to kind of explain a little bit about what that is, what the job entails, all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say this first. It all makes sense getting to look back, but there are so many milestones in that and kind of turning points where I was more laying on the floor going, what am I doing? Is this even a forward progression? Now looking back, it's like, oh, this made sense. I had that job and that led to this. And, but at the time, it definitely felt very like I was going down a rabbit hole that nobody else had gone down. So to encourage everyone else who's listening, I did not have that figured out. And if you took a snapshot of me at any point before kind of today, I'd be the same discombobulated mess as everyone else at that stage in their lives, right? So a research chef, in my experiences, has been very similar to product developers. So a lot of food scientists and food science majors want to go into product development. And essentially how I describe it for kind of non-food scientists is that if you look at a product on a shelf, that product has gone through the hands of a team similar to mine, who come up with the ideas for the product and then go through all of the iterative experimentation and recipe development and then commercialization to get that product onto your shelf. And there's a whole lot of stuff that happens in between. And that's actually my favorite part, is the product development piece, the kind of wicked problem that we have to unravel together. It's everything from ideation with your marketing and brand managers to say, oh, we need something new to fit the segment that we have or this line of products that we have. It can be, trying to figure out a new ingredient substitution because the one you used to use doesn't work anymore, or isn't available anymore in the case of supply chain drama today. Or you go to the production run and the thing just totally fails. Say your cake doesn't rise sort of situation. You're like, oh my gosh, what happened? And you're looking at the efficacy of the ingredients that you used or the types or the process. And so all of those steps are involved in product development. And it really varies depending on the company. I've also seen that other research chefs kind of tend on the side of concept development and innovation, and they don't get involved in the commercialization process. Sometimes that's a completely different team. I think the key with a research chef is we really combine food technology and culinary arts, which the Research Chefs Association calls culinology. If you combine culinary and technology, you get culinology. Clever, yes.
Creative, yeah.
Yeah. And that's really where our sweet spot is. We tend to be on the culinary end of food science, but there are plenty of research chefs who have advanced degrees in food science. There are also plenty of product developers, food scientists who have culinary backgrounds. So they're not mutually exclusive.
Okay. Yeah, no, that is, I think that's really good for, people who don't necessarily know what, all that stuff entails. And yeah, which, like, I know personally, a lot of people who are like, yeah, I really like, culinary stuff, but they didn't want to become a chef and like, didn't know what other options there were, in that sort of area. And so like, how common, what is like the job market for, a research chef?
That is such a great question, because it's kind of hard to tell, because the roles kind of vary among the companies and the industry. It kind of depends on the organization you're applying to. Really large multinational companies could have a whole culinary team. And so there could be quite a few jobs, and you might have a 25-year career runway in one company. For others, and for my personal experience, I've worked for most companies that are less than $1 billion in size. And so oftentimes the research chef role is just that. And there isn't necessarily a ladder climb. There can be some title changes, but usually you're kind of the research chef. At least for me, I've usually been one of one. for other organizations where culinary teams are really complex, they can have a whole kind of stratosphere to go through as well.
Okay. Yeah. So that makes sense where, it's a lot of the places that are like smaller don't necessarily have like a team of research chefs. It's like, hey, you're the chef person. All right, we're going to give you everything. It's like, all right, cool. Awesome. Thanks.
Sweet. Yeah. I mean, and product developers or food scientists who take on roles in smaller companies may find themselves being the dishwasher, the research chef, the product developer, QA. They might end up doing it all. And I honestly really like those types of jobs. The bullet point on your resume is a little less impressive. If you work for, I don't know, Ziggy Baker's cake company, nobody's going to have heard of it, say, versus if you had Cargill or Kraft on your resume. But at the same time, there are advantages to working for those smaller companies where you end up wearing so many more hats. You get to see a lot more of the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that I've definitely appreciated about a lot of the jobs that I've held, whether it's working for, the winery that I work at or working for, like Beyond Meat or whatever. Just being able to do a lot of different things within that role. So you're not kind of like pigeonholed into one thing, constantly doing the same thing over and over again, which a lot of people do like, but, there's people like you or myself who enjoys being able to, put on a bunch of different hats, so to speak.
Well, I'm going to turn the tables on you and ask you about your journey, because you also are not sitting in a very typical position, but really getting to flex your food science knowledge. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So like I said earlier, I didn't really know about food science, and then kind of through, circumstances learned what it was. I initially wanted to work for Ben & Jerry's and create ice cream flavors. I thought that was like the coolest job in the world. And then, from there ended up from Southern California, going to the University of Missouri, to, pursue a food science degree. They have 3 different emphasis areas in the science category of food science. So you have to choose 2, and I ended up doing all 3. So there's meat, dairy, and wine. And then, being from California, I know that, the wine industry is such a large industry, but I didn't know how integral Midwest wine was in that entire wine story. Which I, learned through school. So, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that before Prohibition and, after the United States was like expanding more into the Midwest, more West Coast, the Midwest, like Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, like all that stuff was the center of winemaking in the United States. And in Hermann, Missouri, which is a small town in Missouri where there were a lot of German settlers. They had the Stonehill Winery, which was at the time the 2nd largest winery in the United States and the 3rd largest in the entire world, I believe. And so, learning about that, and then, learning about how in France there was like a phylloxera outbreak, which is a little insect that basically eats the roots of the grapevines, and that was decimating the French wine industry. And there was a guy, Charles Riley, I believe, from Herman, who figured out that the native grapes and the native vines that were here in the United States were resistant to phylloxera. So they shipped out a bunch of the rootstocks over there, and they grafted the French wines onto the American rootstocks. And so that basically saved the entire French wine industry. And then, Prohibition hit, and that kind of killed winemaking in the Midwest. In Kansas specifically, which is where my winery's at, they were the first state to have a statewide prohibition in 1881, I believe. So like years and years and years before the federal one. And they were one of the last states to end their state prohibition in like 1940 something. So Kansas was like way behind. So a lot of the vines that were there, kind of became neglected. And like, it sort of came to where people were like, oh, the Midwest can't make good wine because, there weren't a lot of winemakers that were still left around in the Midwest. Everybody's going out, west to sunny state of California and Oregon and Washington, all that stuff. And so it's cool to see now. Missouri's a little bit further ahead because also they have better alcohol laws because Kansas is still kind of trying to catch up. But, with the winery that I work at, we're trying to prove that you can make good wine in Kansas. And, not just sweet wines, which I don't have an issue with. Like, drink what you like. That's the main point. But, we make a lot of dry reds, dry whites, and all that stuff. So just learning about all of that was kind of what got me interested in that sort of stuff. And then, I also like homebrew beer, so like, all that stuff is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to be very curious to see how Midwest wine does come back, I guess, technically speaking, from say the 40s onwards. So I'm curious. So the vines that would have been in the Midwest, did those get like plowed under? So you're having to take roots from California, or how does that work?
Yeah. So they were literally, so during Prohibition, you mean? Like when they, so they literally had to like pull out all of the vines and whatnot. There was only one, I think, in Missouri that was allowed to keep theirs. It was like in like the St. Louis area. It was owned by like Jesuits, and they were making Sacramento wine. So that, so like that's kind of, they were like the only ones. But yeah, and like, Missouri, like after Prohibition, they were the first state to have the first federally recognized AVA, which is American Viticulture Area, in Augusta, Missouri. So like, they, having to replant and then remake the soil to be, good, and like relearn all of the knowledge that was lost, basically, surrounding all of those, grapes that were native to here.
So your role there then, in using your food science background, what is your role, and then how do you get to use food science every day?
Yeah, so I like to joke when people ask me what I do at the winery. I basically say whatever they ask me to do, because
I hear you.
Because like I help out with the winemaking stuff. I used to also do the distribution, and I work in the tasting room as well. So, like with the winemaking stuff, Sarah, who's the head winemaker there, she does most of the stuff, but I get to help with measurements and taste it. I like to do the tasting stuff especially when we're blending. I have a little bit of a sensory science background in the food science stuff, so like being able to do that part is my absolute favorite part, obviously.
Yeah, the tasting.
Oh yeah, I know, who would have figured that. But yeah, and then working in the tasting room, I think it's fun just like interacting with people and meeting people, and then just seeing what it is that people actually like, because you want to be able to serve the customers what they like, and getting that sort of feedback is also integral in like the food science part of a lot of the things that I think a lot of people don't necessarily recognize.
Yeah, fully agree. Wow, that's such a cool background and kind of the history lesson about wine in the Midwest as well. I had no idea. So I guess the other question then is, where do you see your career going in wine? Do you, I'm thinking you have a podcast, you're a winemaker, taster, you can go a lot of places.
Oh man, that's the question, right? I mean, I'm 25, so I have time to, actually process and think about that stuff. People ask if I want to be a sommelier. I don't know if I want to do all that, but I don't know. That's a great question. And something that I'm still trying to parse through,
Totally.
But at this juncture, I'm like, if I can get people to at least, recognize that, hey, we make wine out here, guys, and It's not all garbage, I promise. Like, I think that's a good thing.
So I guess the other question then is, what would success look like to you? That your winery gets an award, or that what would that look like for you?
I mean, for me, success, like I just think of success as if somebody comes into the winery and they try the wines, they have a good experience, they like the wines, they like the people that are working there, and they tell other people or they want to come back. That to me is what constitutes success in wine and and a lot of things, I think.
I hear you. Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, 25 for perspective, I went to culinary school at 27. So, I felt like I had to make up a lot of lost time. In the end, I think I would have scolded myself and said, don't feel that way. And just, the things that I did before I was 27, before I went to culinary school, all those things have informed how I am as a leader and as an entrepreneur today. So I can't regret any of those things. But I definitely felt like I was behind the eight ball, especially when I met individuals like you who looked like you had so much more of your pieces all together in a row. And maybe it's a facade, but it's a really impressive one.
I was like, thank you for thinking that I look like I do. I appreciate
You're 25, you have a podcast. It's pretty impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, and like with your podcast, how did that sort of come about for you?
Such a good question. So Peas on Moss is literally a wordplay on mise en place, obviously spelled very differently, but it's to help us American tongues without any French training learn how to speak without completely butchering every word we say in French. I read it in a book about mise en place in the culinary setting. And I use the play on the words because it illustrates that a career doesn't have to have all of its things in its place, which is the definition of mise en place. Our careers happen because time just progresses. So, and I guess our lives fall forward, hopefully, versus backwards or sideways. So the whole point of Peas on Moss is building a career by falling forward, hopefully into more successes and getting to build on those. But the key to my career has been the mentors and the friends and the peers that I know who we spend more time building each other up and challenging each other and offering connections when we can. And that's how my career has been built. So the podcast is literally stories of other people who have built really cool careers in food, whether that's in the most really obvious ways as principal scientist, or if it's in the less obvious ways, which I would argue is potentially your position and mine, where we have food science experiences, but we're applying them in really different ways. Mm-hmm. So Peas on Moss is a celebration of the people in the food industry. And, every conversation we have, I learn something. And so I've gotten to grow from these. I'm so lucky to get to amplify other voices. And in that, I've learned so much from other people. So that's the podcast.
Nice. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with that. And, I know that, you're on a time crunch here. Do you have any advice for people who might be interested in becoming a research chef at all?
Oh, yeah, do it. So quick resources, go to the Research Chefs Association website, culinology.org. We have an annual conference every March. The next one is in Atlanta at the end of March. And so tickets are open now. That's the quickest way to get into the research chef world, is to go to the conference. There's tons of trainings on the website too. So if you just want to learn what research chefs do in different types of companies, you can go on there. And a lot of the content requires membership. There are student memberships, there are introductions. They're doing a member drive now. So, it's a great time to go looking into it. The IFT, obviously, Institute of Food Technologists, it's a great landing zone for food scientists. A lot of us are both members of IFT and RCA, so I, wouldn't feel bad about doing one or the other or anything like that. If you have a passion for a type of food, go into that. Get to know how you would make that at a super large factory scale. And that'll give you an idea of what the work is, whether you'd be involved in it directly or indirectly. And that kind of, could be a good gut check to see if you really want to spend a 4 a.m. shift call time to watch ingredients get measured. And then you stand there watching the factory workers accidentally dump something on the floor, and then you have to reformulate on the fly. It's traumatizing and kind of exhilarating at the same time. So, and everybody's like, "Ooh, yeah, we've been there."
Yeah. Oh man, yeah. Well, Kimberly, thank you so much for being on the podcast and having this conversation with me, and just sharing about you and your podcast and the world of research chefs. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Rich, for sharing air together. And I'm so excited to celebrate success in the wine industry in the Midwest. We'll have to plan a trip out to Kansas. I'll have to admit that's once you get your recognition and your rewards, then it'll be easier to get a trip justified to Kansas.
Yeah, exactly. I live in Kansas City, Missouri, so we got the Chiefs and we got barbecue. So
those are good reasons. Okay, I'll write that down, bump it up the list a little.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
My guest today was Miss Kimberly Schaub. Kimberly Schaub is a research chef and senior food scientist working in business development at Griffith Foods. And she founded the Peas on Moss website and podcast in 2009. With a nutritional science background, management training from the U.S. Air Force, and culinary scientist certification from the Research Chefs Association, RCA, Kimberly brings a unique eye to culinary arts and food science. Peas on Moss itself is a wordplay on mise en place, and the goal is to highlight the varied pathways and successes in the food manufacturing industry. Peas on Moss leverages the podcast platform to invite a larger audience to consider the craft and business of getting food to their grocery store shelves and on their plates. Through conversational interviews, Kimberly invites the guests to share their career experiences and expertise, fostering a space where food science and technology are shared in an accessible and engaging way. Through Peas on Moss, Kimberly hosts the RCA Hustlers Under 40 as a way to serve young professionals growing their careers post-college, as well as a few other fireside chats focused on diversity, active inclusion, and equity in the industry, and career paths for research chefs for culinary professionals. Get more information at peasonmoss.com. That's peasonmoss.com. And thank you to all of our listeners. We hope you enjoyed the show. Maybe you learned something new about a job you didn't know existed, or discovered something you might want to do in the future. Either way, I hope we made your lives a little bit richer. Until next time, this is Richie, signing out.